We are in for some big changes. Vance Crowe, after over 100 legacy interviews, has some perspective on just what some of those changes are.
The thing that strikes me the most about this is very soon we will no longer have a population of people that lived without electricity.
Today on episode 425 of the Working Cows podcast, he's also going to share about some of the common lessons that he's seen from the people he's been interviewing.
I don't know how many older adults have told me one of the biggest regrets I have in my life is how much time I spent worrying. Worrying is a form of being asleep. It's a way of thinking about either the past or the future, but it is not being present.
As well as some of the ways that this project has changed him.
In the middle of those moments as catastrophe is all around you, and to laugh and to be like, this is just the absurdity of life. And it wasn't any easier any time earlier, and it won't be any easier any time in the future. And so I personally started saying, I don't know how much of this I believe, but the act of going to church and behaving as though I believe appears to have really positive impacts on the relationships between husbands and wives, on the way they impact their own children, on the way they think about community.
We're going to discuss all that and more today on the Working Cows podcast, brought to you by Ranch Right and the South Dakota Grassland Coalition.
Welcome to the podcast that gives producers a platform to discuss and share paradigm-challenging practices. Practices that have increased the effectiveness of their operation and the joy that their families have received from this lifestyle.
Howdy, everybody. It's Clay Connery, host of the Working Cows podcast, recorded exclusively in the Understanding Ag Studios. Very excited to be joined today, once again, by Vance Crowe. Vance has been doing great work with legacy interviews over the years, and he's posted a tweet recently that made me, or maybe it's a post now on X. Anyways, he made a post recently that got me thinking about what are some of the broader lessons that Vance has been learning from talking to people in their 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, even 90s about how they view their life and what they've learned. And I think a project like that can't help but change you. And so I wanted to talk to him about some of that today on the Working Cows podcast. And we're going to do that right after a word from our sponsor today, Ranch Right. Does a year's worth of tax prep stand between you and being able to send things to your accountant? Are you tired of email after email asking for documents that you don't know how to find? Are you wondering exactly how much money you will owe the IRS this year and have no clue how to even start to figure that out? We've been there, but you don't have to. Hire Ranch Right and know where your business stands. Taxes are a part of life, but Ranch Right helps you with data entry, bookkeeping, reports that you can make sense of, and a realistic outlook on what your business needs this tax season. Visit ranchrightllc.com today and cross tax prep off your list. Vance, thanks for joining me again on the Working Cows podcast. Welcome back.
Man, I mean it when I say it's an honor to be back.
Well, I appreciate that. And we were just talking a little bit here before we got going about the legacy interviews you've been doing, and then I've done some similar kind of work in my own neighborhood and travel a little bit to do it. But one of those interviews that I did recently passed away, and him and his wife actually passed away a week apart. They're doing both of their funerals together today on the day that we're recording this. And it's just kind of an amazing amount of history. 74 years married. He was 95. She was in her early 90s. So, just an amazing amount of history all in one place there. And you've been doing these legacy interviews, quite a few of them. And I just wanted to ask you kind of how has it shaped the way you think about the recent past in America, and what have been kind of some of the nuggets you've gleaned from that?
I mean, that is such an enormous question, because as somebody that's had a chance to sit down with hundreds of people to tell their life stories, you can't help but be impacted by it. And, I have the chance to ask people things that range as wide from like, what kind of appliances did your mom have in the house? And you discover Mom didn't have any appliances. There was no electricity, or we didn't have running water. I went to an outhouse, or I didn't have, a way to have a hot bath for, until I was 12 or 13 years old, all the way up to the experience and the wisdom and the advice that people have that are, like you were saying, that couple in their 90s. So all of these things combined together, I would say that psychologically, I have probably done as much shaping in this part of my life that I did maybe when I was in high school or, as an adolescent, because I'm getting drips of distilled wisdom every single day. So it's very difficult for me to say what exactly has changed in my life. Although I think probably the biggest one is how I parent my kids.
Wow. Yeah. So I want to dive into that in a minute, but it is kind of crazy just how recent a lot of those innovations are. Like, my mom was born in 1951 in Elmira, New York, which is kind of on the New York-Pennsylvania border. And they didn't have running water or electricity in her house. 74 years ago. And so, a lot of those changes that you're talking about are so recent. They're just very, very, not very far back that we have a lot of these innovations that have kind of come on the scene. What have been some of the striking ones?
The thing that strikes me the most about this is very soon we will no longer have a population of people that lived without electricity or lived without running water. And everyone's memory will be of what it's like to live in this modern age. But we have a few people out there, that tell you, I interviewed a guy a couple weeks ago who his family, when they were in Kansas, were farming with horses. And, talking about how much pasture ground you had to have and how much space to be able to, how much hay you had to put up in order to be able to have horses that are strong enough at the end of winter to be able to go out there and plow up your field. And oh, by the way, you're plowing that field one row at a time. And to imagine what his perspective is to go from that to GPS guided tractors, that can do 36 rows. It's mind boggling. It's simply incomprehensible. And I can only imagine what will our lives be like that.
Yeah. 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 Well, put it into perspective again, where, how many years from the Wright brothers to, let's colonize Mars. It just is crazy how fast these things have changed. What have been some of the things that you feel like, you mentioned the way you parent your kids. Can you give me an example how that played out?
Well, there's just so much about when you're in the first person experience of raising your kids, you have stress in your life, right? You have the check engine light comes on, your kid is struggling. Maybe they're getting bullied or they've had challenges in their lives. And you just have all these things going on. And your perspective is, I'm worried about it and I'm so nervous about it. And I don't know how many older adults have told me, one of the biggest regrets I have in my life is how much time I spent worrying. And that really it's made it clear to me that worrying is a form of being asleep. It's a way of thinking about either the past or the future, but it is not being present. And there are a lot of times when I'm with my kids and I think about that, 85-year-old man that talks about how special those just few years you get with a little tiny child, and that how he wishes he wouldn't have been worried about things. And it makes me wake up in the middle of those moments as catastrophe is all around you, and to laugh and to be like, this is just the absurdity of life. And it wasn't any easier any time earlier, and it won't be any easier any time in the future. I have the gift of being here right now.
Let's take a quick break and hear a word from our sponsor today, the South Dakota Grassland Coalition. If you're in the business of managing livestock, you've probably experienced drought, shortage of time, not enough help, and hefty debt. But facing one or even all of these challenges doesn't have to leave you worrying about how you'll make it through another year. Learn how to increase your stocking rates, extend your grazing season, increase plant diversity, retain moisture in your soil, spend less time and money on weed control, and much more at one of South Dakota Grassland Coalition's grazing schools. During this 3-day intensive program, area producers along with presenters from state and local agencies combine hands-on activities in the field with classroom-style presentations to walk you through the steps necessary to create a grazing plan that suits your unique operation. Reserve your spot at one of the 3 grazing schools today at sdgrass.org. Yeah. I saw that quote that you posted the other day, and worry is a form of being asleep. That's powerful.
and I mean, it's so easy to get into because we oftentimes think like I'm doing the right thing by being worried, by being alert, and when I think of it in terms of raising my kids, like, no, I'm not. They need a guy that's right there laughing at their jokes and correcting their mistakes and, being there with them instead of worrying.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, one of the, this is weird for a pastor to say, but I've been becoming more aware of how practical the Bible is recently. And one of the things that's super practical in the Bible is be anxious for nothing, but in all things by prayer and supplication, let your requests be made known to God, and the peace of Christ will guard your hearts. It's like, well, duh. Yeah, just when you're tempted to worry, turn it over and let him sort it out and leave it there. Don't run back and grab it and try and take it back for your own control. Just say, I'm going to leave it in your hands. I'm going to pay attention to these kids that you've entrusted to me to raise them. And yeah, what a powerful way to look at it for sure. What are some other things that you've been surprised by? Some of the things that I totally identify with what you said about it's hard to know how this is impacting you. People ask me that all the time about how has the podcast changed you, impacted you, and it's like, I don't know. Maybe I'm too close to it to be aware of how it's impacted me. Sorry, another church illustration. I often think the benefit of sitting in church is not necessarily how much do you remember. It's just the fact that you were there as the word of God was read and proclaimed. You don't have to worry about, did I remember every point? It's, I was there, and all of the grit from the week is just blown away as the word is read and proclaimed. And I think that's somewhat like how hosting a podcast or doing these interviews is, where you're changed. You're not really exactly sure how, but you know that you're different because of it. So I don't know if there's other specific things.
Oh yeah, there's one that's very clear. You'll get a big kick out of this, Clay, because of how much guff I gave you on my podcast about, I don't know about pastors. This isn't really my thing. I one day came to the conclusion, like, there are so many people that have come in and done these legacy interviews, and some of them are well-to-do. Some of them, they weren't well-to-do, but their kids were. And some of them are just regular people, but they're happy, and they have a family that's happy. And one of the things that I have seen so clearly is I ask them, what should your children or future generations know about God? And almost all of the ones that are happy and fulfilled in their lives say, oh, it's so important to go to church. It's so important to have prayer. And so I had to eventually look at that and be like, do you think you are somehow better than this? Is you somehow know more than these people? And so I personally started saying, I don't know how much of this I believe, but the act of going to church and behaving as though I believe appears to have really positive impacts on the relationships between husbands and wives, on the way they impact their own children, on the way they think about community. And so, a few months ago, I started making it a regular practice to go to church with my wife and my kids. And I mean, that is not something that I would have ever predicted. It's not something I wanted, but I can already tell that by listening to that advice, it's having an impact on my family.
Has your strategy in these sessions changed at all over time? Like, have you things that have been like, oh, this is something that I need a question I need to ask everyone, or some of those things has that changed over time?
I think the biggest thing that's changed for me is the ability to truly just sit and listen. I think when you're first coming up and you're an interviewer, like a podcaster, right? You're asking a person a question that you think is clever, and then you're kind of sitting there being like, all right, they're answering, that was good, but now what's going to be my next question? And now I've done hundreds and hundreds of interviews, and what I've come to realize is a question will be there when they're done talking. But like, if I can focus on like really listening to what they're saying, actually reacting to what it is that this person is going through as they're reliving a story or a memory, and be there with them, I don't have to think about the next question. One just appears. And that level of confidence and comfort with the present moment has really impacted not just the way I do the legacy interviews, but also my podcast. And I actually changed the format of my podcast because I was like, well, one thing that's really effective in legacy interviews is that we don't do hey, we're starting and now we're stopping. We just kind of slowly go into it and we're just listening. And then when it's done, it's done. And we find a right place to cut it. Well, I started doing that with the podcast because I wasn't like, welcome to the podcast. And it made a real difference in the way that people responded. So finding how to be present has been very important.
Yeah, I think that is a huge thing. Obviously we talk a lot about that. Don't listen to respond. You want to listen to hear what they're saying. And I think that is a big part of it. Is there a right time that you think we need to think about doing a legacy interview? Or maybe, how many years are you into this?
I've been doing this for about 5 years now.
Okay. I'm wondering if maybe there's like this opportunity to capture one person multiple times over the span of 20, 30 years or something like that, and kind of get some different perspective from the same person. Is there a right time to start, do you think, or how have you been approaching that?
So we have people that range anywhere from 55 till we've done just over 100. And I think that what you're getting out of those interviews are different things. So for example, the person in their late 50s, what they are just experiencing was, we're capturing the memories that we have when they are the freshest, not just about my own childhood, but about raising my own kids. The things that you capture with people that are in their 80s or 90s. We were just at a farm up in central Iowa, and the things that we're capturing with these 85-year-old couple, this married couple, is very different because their memories of what it was like to raise kids is not as sharp, right? There's just a lot of stuff that gets kind of mashed together. And now we're talking about things from a much higher level, from a much further distant point. And those are beautiful interviews, right? In those cases, the grandparents get to say the names of each of their grandchildren who are maybe too young to even remember their grandparents if they were to pass on. And so what you're capturing and what the experience is different. And I think that I have found that people have said, this was really good to help me move past life events that are maybe more impactful than they thought. So, the empty nest syndrome, that's a real thing. Maybe a few years after your kids have moved out, you want to capture some of those stories. And it apparently, the way that it seems to me is it allows people to like look back on it, be joyful about it, remember that they got through all those chaotic, hard times you were talking about before, and they can set it down. And then they move on to a new phase in their life where they're no longer grieving the fact that their kids aren't there anymore. Now they are embracing the new role of being an adult without children and hoping that they can have grandchildren. And the same thing is true of people after somebody has passed away. We often say, don't do it within the first 6 months, maybe not even the first year. But after you've had some time to grieve, when you come in and talk about it while the memories are still fresh, it allows people to tell those stories that they haven't had a chance to just sit down and reflect on. And that's been a really interesting way to help people move from one phase of life to another.
Have you spotted things that are stark differences between generations or between people? You mentioned the way that they talk about raising kids and the fact that, the older you get, the more high level these interviews become. Are there other things or even philosophies, ways of looking at the world or money or things like that are stark differences to you between different generations and how they look at those things?
That's a great question. I think the bigger thing that I've noticed is that as people age, they often have less advice for people. And I've noticed this over time, that if you're in your 60s and 70s and I say, hey, do you have any advice for future generations? They have like a lot of, yeah, remember this and think about that and consider this. But if you ask an 85-year-old person that, they often sit there and say, No, not really. Like they're going to do it their own way and they're going to figure it out. And I think that is actually representative of a brain chemistry change. I think there is a phase somewhere around 65 where people move from being these kind of to-do, I've got to get things done, I can see how things are working and what we've got to get done. And then as you get older and older, your brain doesn't maybe move as fast, you're not as gripped on to things, and you're able to just let things float by. So this certainly isn't universally true, but I have noticed that people that are older, they don't have as much confidence that they know what's right for you, but they're more than happy to share what happened with them.
Do you think that has something to do with maybe not regretting missed opportunities? I mean, like, I think when we're 50 to 70, maybe we're still in that mode of regretting some of the missed opportunities. And by the time we get to 80, 85, we're maybe beyond that regret a little bit and willing to say, those things aren't even as big of a deal as I thought they were in my 50s to 70s.
Well, you asked the question that allows me to talk about like my secret hypothesis. This is like how I think the world works. And that is that I think that when, for most of human civilization, there was a very important role that families all lived together. Parents lived with their parents, and then the grandkids were around. And when the parents were pulling out their hair because that kid just wouldn't stop asking why, that's when grandpa would scoop them up and take them outside and start saying, hey, we're going to sharpen this knife. And, oh, let me tell you about the first knife my father gave me or my grandfather gave me. Or let me tell you a story about the first time I had this thing happen. And grandma gets asked all these questions about, tell me about it when you were young, grandma. And these kids are hungry for these stories. And it's a part of them trying to grasp as much wisdom and experience as they can. But I think that this had a really deeply important role for the grandparents, because I think when you tell your stories, when you get those out, it gives you a way to stop coming back and cycling on them. It gives you a chance to be like, that is something that we accomplished, and I don't need to be that person anymore. And I think there's a real superpower that comes from communicating and looking back on your life, and I don't think you can do it alone. I think it requires other people. And now that we don't have grandparents and grandchildren living so close together, I think it isn't happening as much. And I think that what this means is it's a lot harder for dad to let go of being the boss. It's a lot harder for mom to say, I'm going to let somebody else run the holidays this year. I'm going to let somebody else fill that role. And so I think in some ways, getting people to tell their stories in effect allows that psychological change to happen between being, in the late stages of your summer into the beginning years of fall and maybe winter.
You mentioned earlier that we're kind of we're going to eventually cross that Rubicon of being the only, or the generations have grown up with electricity, with running water. You're not exclusively interviewing people who are necessarily agriculturalists, correct, in these legacy interviews?
Yeah, no, we do everybody, but it seems like ag is the one that loves it. They know it, they understand it.
Yeah. But I also think that a lot of the people who maybe are living in cities now grew up in an agricultural context. The majority of them. Would you say that's accurate from your experience?
Yes, certainly there's a bunch of people that lived in much smaller towns. They now are living, maybe they raise their kids in a city and their kids live in the suburbs and they bring their grandma and granddad in. And even if they weren't farming, their dad, ran the grocery store, or he was a banker, but in a small town. So people definitely, in the last, if they're in their 80s now, they were much more likely to be from a small town than they are now.
Yeah. I wonder, and that's kind of the leading question, I wonder if you have a sense of how that might impact us as a society, where we're moving away from running water and electricity. People who grew up without those, we're also moving away from those people who probably grew up on a farm. I think it was 90% pre-World War II, 90% agrarian, and now we're right around 1%, right, agrarian. And so, I mean, there's got to be an impact there, right?
I think the biggest impact that I hear and see, and I see it in my own life, is that the fabric of community, where you knew everybody's name and you were connected with people, was much stronger. And so now there are services that I may be able to get a higher level of service on my demands, whatever I want, if I can pay for it. And in the past, you probably had like a, where you have, hey, I'm going to do you this favor and you're going to do me this favor, but we're connected. And I think that a lot of that goes away the larger and larger cities that you live in. And I know that I grew up in a kind of 1950s style childhood because I grew up in small town central Illinois, but I don't think that exists even in that small town that I grew up in. I think that there was so much more where everybody knew each other, that created a social cohesion, expectations. And sure, I think there were a lot of downsides. I'm not being nostalgic about it, but I think that you think about the difference between my children and me. In church, for example, I knew literally every single person in my church. I knew not just who they were, but who their kids were, who they were related to, where they lived. I knew everything about them. We could go to my church for 20 years, and I think we will only know a small fraction of the people in that church. And that's just a function of the fact that there are way more members, and it's a much bigger church serving a much bigger group. And I think that that's a cultural change that we may struggle to get back to.
Yeah, for sure. I always tell people that living here, coming to church here is like going back in time 70 years, so back to the 50s, because it is still like that. Everybody knows everybody. We're on a good Sunday, we're 80 people, and half of those are kids under the age of 18, so I mean, it's a lot like going back in time, 70 years, and I love it in a lot of ways, for sure. And there is that neighboring aspect, you come help me at my branding, I'll go help you at yours, and we don't expect to exchange money on this deal. We're just going to exchange the labor, and that, everybody, I think it, and those branding events, those community events might 50 years ago in Illinois, it might have been Harvest, but those community type events, I tell people all the time, it's like Thanksgiving, except for it's it's 3 to 5 Thanksgivings a week at different people's houses for a month. I mean, you're constantly going to somebody else's house, but it's just this huge meal. Everybody, people are spread out on the lawn if the weather's nice and you're eating. It's just a totally different world, really, than a lot of people experience. And I kind of wonder if you've come across or had thoughts about how to recover some of those things that are worth recovering through these interviews you've been doing.
Well, it's certainly something I think a lot about, and I talk with my wife about. We have been really conscientious about, hey, we need to spend time with friends. So one of my favorite questions to ask people in a legacy interview, if I ask, your parents, hey, your parents drink and smoke? Right? You don't want to talk badly about your parents. You don't want to say anything that might, hurt their reputation, whatever that is. You might be uncomfortable with that. So I don't ask that. What I ask is, what kind of people did your parents spend time with? Or what did they do with their friends? Now all of a sudden people will be like, oh man, when mom and dad got together with their friends to play bridge, that's when the ashtrays and the bourbon came out. And they're willing to talk about that relationship. They're willing to talk about that dynamic. And one of the things that I noticed was Saturday night, for a lot of people that lived in rural America, was when they got together with friends. They either went to town because they were going to do their grocery shopping or they were going to see a show, or that's when they got together and did cards and they made these things, where groups of people would come together. They went to dances, right? So my wife and I have tried to make a very active effort for how can we make it so it is a regular thing. It is not hard for people to know, hey, what do we do on Saturday night? Well, the Crows always have their little campfire out on in their backyard, and we know we can stop by. We just give them a call and tell them we're coming, and we're going to just bring a plate of food to share. And that has helped create that sense of community that I was feeling longing for. And I think that that's the kind of thing that will bring that back. Ultimately, I don't think it can be brought back. I think that unless we have a radical change to society, we buy so many services that I think that we're not going to be able to get that community back unless you're intentionally living in much smaller groups.
Yeah, give me some examples of what you mean by buying services. What are some of the things that you've noticed as commonalities from these legacy interviews?
Well, I mean, a service that was done since time immemorial is the next door neighbor lady that took care of the kids, or babysitting that would happen because you knew a neighborhood girl that she wanted to buy, a new dress or like candy or whatever. So she was willing to come and babysit. Now parents are much more focused on, hey, I got to make sure my kids are getting every opportunity to play sports or be in, doing music lessons. So it's much more difficult for you to find a neighbor lady or neighborhood kids to do babysitting. So what do? Well, you go find a private service that hires the college kids that you don't really interact with. They do a background check on them. And now you pay both the kid and the service to have a babysitter. Well, this would be unthinkable in the past. But now is one of the primary ways that me and most of the people that I know find a babysitter when you're really hard up for somebody that you need to step in and take care of your kids.
Huh. Yeah. Yeah, that is interesting. So I want to shift the conversation a little bit and talk about kind of some of the other, it's connected, right? There are shifts happening in society. One of them, I think is something you just mentioned, is about entertainment. Can the average middle-class family afford weekly entertainment, to go every week to some kind of entertainment? And a lot of that stuff, I think, has probably outpaced their ability to do that regularly. And so I think your solution is a great idea. Campfire in the backyard, just let us know you're coming and we'll have some community. And I think that's another thing, is it doesn't have to be this huge production. It's just simple, and we create the space, and some of those, they figure out ways to entertain themselves, right? We play cornhole, or we, do whatever. And so I think those are some of the things. But some of these shifts, I think, are in a lot of ways driven by the economics of the world that we live in. And so how are we going to kind of innovate in our own space and try to create some of those opportunities for entertainment without needing to, mortgage the house again?
I think what people want is a place to feel welcomed. They want to feel where they know, hey, what can I do to be a contributor here? What can I do to be somebody that's successful? And what can I do that makes it so, I'm not spending a ton of money. One of the most important things I did more than a decade ago was every Thursday night I started meeting with a couple of my friends. And my wife very graciously said, okay, I understand that Thursday night, that is Vance's time. And so we made that very important, and it made it so you continually meet with the same group of people. And this is just like planting a tree, right? You can't go backwards and plant a tree, but showing up regularly, doing things with people over and over and over again. Now the relationship, the conversation, the things that we can work on together is so much deeper because we made that time and made it happen over and over and over again. And I think in our modern fast-paced world, that's one of the biggest pieces of advice I have for young people, particularly once you get married and you start having kids, because life goes in chaotic directions. And so trying to find stable ways to say, I know what I'm doing here, I can predict, I can build around this, has been very helpful to me.
Are there rules that you have for that time? Like amongst the guys, like these are the rules, no phones or something like that. Are there rules that you have for that time with the guys?
Yeah, I don't know that. I'm sure there are things that are like norms that if somebody started doing something, if you're sitting on your phone, people would be like, is something wrong? Like, what are you doing here? And, when you get a group of guys that have known each other for years, the barbing, like giving them guff about whatever's going on in their lives, that can get pretty sharp and pretty fun. But I think that it's a culture that I don't know that we have any formal rules, but we certainly know what's expected.
Right. And I think that also, like you said, you plant a tree 10 years ago, but you can't do that. So we start here, and sometimes you have to be patient to reap fruit from that tree, right? Or you actually always have to be patient to reap fruit from that tree. So just know that probably that time of having that time with the guys, there's going to be some superficiality at the beginning, but years down the road, there's going to be that depth of relationship, right?
Yeah, I think one of the most important things that somebody can do, this is advice my mother used to always give me. She was like, if you find that there's something in your life that you don't have, then you should become that for somebody else. So this was in reference to, my grandparents all passed away when I was very young. And so my mom was always like, all right, well, I didn't have grandparents to give my kids, so I'm going to go be a grandparent to somebody else that's like that. And she really tried to fulfill that role, that mentoring role. I think that's true of getting people together. You may not think of yourself as the extrovert. You may not think of yourself as the person that gets other people together. But if you're looking around and you're saying, hey, this isn't happening in my life, the best thing you can do is say, well, I want this, so I'm just going to start. And when I look back on getting that group together, we never set out to be like, hey, let's be a group of guys that meets together every Thursday night for the next 10, 15, 20, 30 years. We just said like, hey, let's get together and let's have good conversation. And I will say this, we are allowed to bring a person to like come to Thursday night. But if you bring a person that doesn't have great conversation, that doesn't have something to say, man, you are going to hear about it the next time. Because we are there, like we know how special it is to have this time away from our other responsibilities. And so setting that up and setting up expectations and letting people know like, hey, this is how to participate, that's what'll make it happen.
I think another example of a way that our world has changed is the alienation of the broader public. We talked a little bit about this earlier from the agricultural life. And so a lot of times the only place they get information about what that's like is from podcasters or YouTubers who also don't have any connection to it. And so it's easy for them. You get, it's like the telephone game. It gets really skewed by the time it gets to the person who's, got that 45-minute commute every morning. And that's where they're listening to these podcasts and getting their information. And so that's bred a lot of distrust between the broader public. I've been hearing them called eaters recently, but that always sounds like a zombie movie. The eaters and the growers, always sounds like the prelude to a zombie movie. But it does breed a lot of distrust between farmers and the broader public who is purchasing the product of their work. So, what are some of the things how are you thinking about this split, this chasm between these two populations?
Yeah, I think that the world is broken up into tribes, right? So we spend time with people that are like us. They listen to the same music. They like the same entertainment activities. They have, more or less the same values. They at least understand what is truth, which news outlets do we trust. And that when we think about it being the growers and the eaters, the growers are a pretty small tribe, right? But even within that growers, like I have this podcast called the Ag Tribes Report, are a whole bunch. Agriculture is actually a whole bunch of really tiny tribes, right? That kind of make up that group. Well, the eaters group that you're talking about is made up of an infinite number of tribes. There's so many of them that it's impossible to say anything, meaningful about all of them at the same time. And so one of the things that I've noticed is a tribe that I'm connected to outside of ag is the Bitcoin tribe. So this is a group of people that find it so interesting that you can create this finite asset and, you can't duplicate it and it could be a way to change the way our currency works, right? When I hear the Bitcoin tribe try to authentically describe what's going on with farmers or what's going on with our food, they are exactly as you were describing. They know nothing. They know so little that it is cringeworthy, where you're like, oh my gosh, I can't believe they think that. But if you want to do any kind of outreach, you can't start with you guys know nothing, because if anybody showed up into ag and said that about anything, you'd get rejected. And so there's a very long, slow way that you can interact with a tribe to get them to change their perspective. But that is the only way to change culture. The only way to change culture is tribe by tribe. And I think that right now we're in I'm going to say something that's a little bit against that. Maybe I should update my model, but we are right now in, I think we've heard of the term, the Overton window. What is acceptable thought? How do we think about things in society? I think that the Trump election plus Doge plus Maha and, these new people that were kind of obscure now becoming mainstream, the ideas that society will be open to are wide open. And right now it's like all the molecules have been shattered apart, and they're going to form new tribes. They're going to form new belief systems. They're going to form new ways of understanding what is true and what's not. And so if ag wants to have an impact, now is the time to have it.
Yeah, you're describing my experience whenever Joe Rogan talks about religion. Like, that is like your perspective. First of all, he's a comedian, so he says things for shock value sometimes. But it's like your perspective is at least the way you're communicating it, is so disconnected from what actually the majority of Orthodox Christians believe that it's like, okay, yep, I'm not threatened by your perspective because it's totally disconnected from what everybody I know thinks anyways. And so I think that's another piece of those, just understanding we have to admit what we don't know, before we're going to be able to have these meaningful conversations and say, hey, help me understand. Right. And I think that's the biggest problem. One of the biggest problems is we start from that position of accusation rather than starting from that position of wanting to understand and actually being curious.
This hits me on something that really has been getting me going on X recently. I've been seeing young people in their 20s come out and say, hey, this is my experience. This is my experience with not wanting to go into debt to buy land, or, my friends, this is what I heard a guy say the other day. My friends are afraid to get married because inflation is so bad. They're afraid they won't be able to provide, a level of comfort for their spouse. And so it's keeping them from it. And what I see ag doing is there's a new young person. He's 20 to 30 years younger than, the tribe of people. And they say, oh, yeah, the people that think that, they're wrong. You should think of it this way. Or, oh, I had those same issues and look at me now, 20 to 30 years later, everything's fine. You should do it my way. And what I find in this is that all you're doing is flexing, right? You're saying what worked in your world instead of saying, even if you flatly disagree with it, that guy that put that out there that you just told was wrong has no interest in listening to you. But if you first were to say hey, tell me more about that. Have you known people that have gone to the bank and they've been rejected? What is this experience like? What you may discover is that he's wrong and he's open to hearing your perspectives because you were open to hearing his. Or what you may also discover is that, like you had said, Joe Rogan maybe has the shock value. He may also just have a different language to describe things. And so he may be saying something that is perfectly aligned with what you think. He's just using different words that are more appropriate to his tribe. And I think there are so many conflicts that happen intra-tribe and intra-generational where it's people are like, hey, I see you using the words that I would use and they would mean this, and that means you're wrong. When the reality is if you had inquired more, you'd have discovered something new and you yourself might have been changed by the interaction instead of just sitting there flexing your muscles in the mirror about how great your success was.
Yeah. And I think it goes back to, not to contradict what I just said, but I think it goes back to having some humility and being comfortable in where you're at and enough to ask questions of other people, not being threatened when they have a different perspective.
Being willing to be wrong on X is something that's astounding. I remember a couple of months ago, I was talking with somebody about deer hunting, right? I had some pretty strong thoughts on how I think that deer should be, the population should be way brought down. Well, I didn't realize there are people out there that don't agree with that perspective. And so they gave me their perspectives on it. And I was like, all right, yeah, okay, I can see that. And the guy was so taken back that I had said, I can see that. I could change my mind. I will change my perspective here. That he accused me of mocking him and that we weren't actually in agreement. I'm like, wait a second, I just agreed with you here. But I think that it's so foreign to most people that that's what happens.
Not being a flame warrior is people don't have a category for that, especially not on X. Yeah, so the Maha movement, you mentioned it earlier, and I've seen you write about this before, about kind of the way that change can sometimes happen in an unhealthy way, and that the Maha movement, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who was confirmed today as we record this.
Was he really?
Yes,
I didn't even know that.
Yes.
Okay, interesting.
So how those changes can sometimes happen in unhealthy ways. Can you talk to me about some of the examples of that, and then maybe how we avoid that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the biggest challenge to the Overton window being open, right? This is when you can move something. So the Overton window looks like this. If you're not familiar, there are ideas that are totally unthinkable in a society. No one would allow them. Then just inside of that, you have radical ideas. So there was a time when if you talked about Bitcoin, most people would be like, hey, stay away from that guy. You're not allowed to talk to him. Then from radical, it goes into, I think it's like people are kind of open to it. I'm trying to remember what the acceptable
Fringe
maybe.
or something.
Yeah. And then you start getting into like, most people in, the left or the right like it. And then in the center of the Overton window, you have policy. Hey, we agreed. This is now what the rules of the land. And during a revolution, or when you have young people, or when you have people that are tearing things down, it's very easy to be like, we know what the problem is. It's that thing right there. So let's just go tear that all out. And then not knowing, kind of like Chesterton's fence, why was that there? Well, we just ripped it all out and thought like, hey, well, we'll build the replacement there in just a little bit and it'll be okay.
Too late.
And
the
so,
barbarians are here.
Exactly. You've already torn down the gate and now, or the fence, and now you don't have anything to hold them back. So that's a big downside to radical shifts. On the other hand, and I would say I've been probably turned around on this, is that like sometimes you look at a system and you say, we're not going to be able to work on it from inside the system. We're not going to be able to make the bureaucracy change. And yes, I realize the danger of tearing this thing down, but maybe it needs to be torn down. And I think that ag is going to find itself at odds over the Maha movement, because I think there's going to be some people, myself included, that look around and say, hey, there are a lot of obese 4-year-olds, right? There does seem to be a lot of cancer in society, right? There are diseases and changes that have happened. And I don't have a good explanation for where that is, but we've spent the last 10, 15, 20 years arguing about it, and the way the traditional way, the mainstream way, isn't helping. And so I think you're going to have some of ag be like, no, we should stay, we shouldn't rip anything down. You're going to have other people be like, rip it down. And I think that ag is going to be more vulnerable than it has ever been in our lifetimes, I think.
Yeah, I think I asked you at the end of my appearance on the Ag Tribes Report, a thought experiment. How many times has Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s name been mentioned positively in any Farm Bureau boardroom in any state ever?
Well, I can tell you that when I was talking with a bunch of young farmers and ranchers out of Arkansas, the young people that are coming up are saying, hey, I want to be able to offer things like raw milk. I want to be able to offer meat that doesn't necessarily get inspected by a USDA inspector. I want to be able to do these things. And so certainly it may not be the boardroom right now, but your membership probably has some positive things to say about him.
Yep, for sure. And, I think that there's a myriad of motivations for those kinds of things, right? Not the least of which is the fact that you're cutting out all the middlemen who are slowly marking that product up to its end price per gallon, and you can capture that for yourself. And that's like probably one of the lower down motivations, but it is a motivation for sure. So yeah, I'm sorry. Like I said, got to run to this funeral, but really appreciate your time today, Vance. Let's tell people where they can find you for legacy interviews and other things you've got your hands in.
Yeah, if you're interested in learning about legacy interviews, just go to legacyinterviews.com. If you want to see a video of a family watching their interview, which I think is actually pretty profound, legacyinterviews.com/experience. And then if you're interested in checking out the podcast, I have one called the Ag Tribes Report. You can just find that by looking up the Vance Crowe podcast.
Very cool. Vance, thanks for your time today.
Thanks, Clay.
Very good stuff there with Vance. Really appreciate his ability to just get perspective on what he's hearing and synthesize lessons out of it, and really enjoyed that conversation. Coming up next on the Working Cows podcast, we're going to have a conversation with Neil Thorstensen, and we're going to talk to him about how he has seen people make big changes on their operation through the right use of different types of grazing infrastructure. And so he's got some perspective, having seen a lot of different people making use of different tools in different contexts. And so really think that gives us an ability to learn some valuable lessons. So look forward to sharing that with you coming your way real soon on another episode of the Working Cows Podcast. We'll see you then.
We invite you to visit workingcows.net to subscribe to the show via iTunes or Stitcher. You'll also find detailed show notes pages, resources from our guests, and the industry leaders who have influenced them. For more ideas on putting your cows to work for you in a more profitable way, tune in next week.